In the winter of 1876, deep in the remote mountains of the Montana Territory, a German physician named Theodor Brennan made a discovery that would haunt him until his final days. Inside a lonely cabin, 23 miles from the nearest settlement, he uncovered medical records documenting 5 generations of deliberate inbreeding within one Irish family. But that was not the most disturbing part. Concealed beneath the floorboards, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, were the preserved bodies of 7 infants. Each bore the same identical deformities, traits that had marked them, in the eyes of their own parents, as unfit to live. The Donnelly family had been practicing selective infanticide for more than a century, eliminating any child born with visible genetic flaws to preserve the illusion of normality. What Dr. Brennan found next would challenge everything the medical world thought it knew about heredity, family loyalty, and the lengths people might go to protect the darkest secrets of their bloodline. The evidence he pieced together suggested this was not an isolated case of frontier madness, but part of a calculated genetic experiment refined over generations, spanning across 2 continents and nearly 100 years of hidden practices. Before we continue with the story of the Donnelly family and their terrifying genetic legacy, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and tap the notification bell. Tell us in the comments which state or city you're listening from. We enjoy hearing from our worldwide community of mystery lovers. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this one. Stories that expose the shadowy corners of American history. The story Dr. Brennan would later detail in his private journals began not in Montana's brutal wilderness, but in the soft, rolling hills of County Cork, Ireland. It was there that the Donnelly bloodline first veered toward genetic disaster during the bitter winter of 1798. The Montana Territory of 1874 was the very edge of American civilization, where government authority existed more in theory than in fact. Helena, the territorial capital, held barely 8,000 people, most clustered around the mining works that had sparked the area's growth. The surrounding mountains were dotted only with scattered mining camps, solitary homesteads, and native tribes still fiercely resisting the advance of white settlers. This was a landscape shaped by hardship and violence, where families might vanish for months with no questions asked, where winter regularly claimed lives, and where the territorial government's reach extended only as far as a deputy could ride through dangerous mountain passes. The gold rush that had once drawn people to Montana was already fading by 1874, leaving behind abandoned mines and desperate men willing to do anything to survive. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of wilderness, making even basic goods scarce and costly. Medical care was nearly non-existent outside Helena, and even there, it was mostly army surgeons and self-taught frontier doctors, their skills limited to sewing up bullet wounds and setting bones. It was exactly this isolation and lack of oversight that made Montana appealing to a certain type of settler, people who needed to vanish from polite society and its uncomfortable questions. Into this harsh setting came Patrick Donnelly, his wife Bridge, and their 4 surviving children, Seamus, aged 19, Moira, then 17, Colleen, 15, and young Declan, barely 12. They arrived in Helena in September 1874 on a freight wagon, their belongings packed in wooden crates that hinted at a level of wealth unusual for typical Irish immigrants. Patrick introduced himself as a prosperous potato farmer, escaping the lingering effects of the Irish famine, but his hands showed none of the calluses of a farm laborer. Instead, his fingers bore the ink stains of a man used to keeping records, and his voice carried the polished accent of someone who had enjoyed formal education. Rare among Irish peasants of that time, Brid Donnelly appeared to locals as a woman always teetering on the edge of collapse. Small-framed and prematurely aged, she seldom spoke above a whisper and kept her children close, in a way that felt more like obsession than affection. Local merchants noticed she paid only in gold coins, counting each piece multiple times before letting it go. Her eyes had a haunted look, as if she had seen horrors far beyond the normal suffering of frontier life. What the Territorio Temacomouma land office didn't know was that the Donnellys carried expertly forged papers from New York, claiming they had lived in Brooklyn for 3 years before heading west. The documents came complete with fake work histories and fabricated references convincing enough to pass any casual inspection. In truth, they had never set foot in New York. They had fled straight from Ireland after a scandal that had shaken their small rural parish. The scandal involved their local priest, Father Michael O'Sullivan, who stumbled upon what he described as an abomination against God and nature within their extended family. Known for his discretion about parishioners' private struggles, our Father O'Sullivan had been so shaken by his discovery that he threatened immediate excommunication and exposure to British authorities. His usually steady hand trembled as he wrote his final warning to Patrick Donnelly. What you have done in the name of bloodline purity is a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance. Leave this parish at once, or I will ensure that every soul in County Cork knows the true nature of your family's evil. In Montana, Patrick purchased 160 acres of secluded mountain land from the territorial government, paying in gold coins, a form of currency common enough among ex-miners that it drew no special attention. The property lay in a narrow valley between two steep ridges, accessible only by a hazardous trail that was completely cut off in the worst of winter. The seclusion was so complete that smoke from their cabin could not be seen from any other homestead, and the nearest creek ran only in summer, before freezing solid for half the year. The site was perfect for a family desperate to hide, but it came with harsh challenges. The short growing season, barely 4 months, demanded expert farming to store enough food for winter. A single night of deep cold could kill livestock. The crushing isolation, with 6 months of snowbound solitude, had driven many frontier families into madness or suicide. Yet the Donnellys set about building their home with the speed and skill of people who had done it before. Patrick and his sons raised a solid log cabin with thick heat, holding walls, small windows to reduce heat loss, and a clever system of interior partitions that could be sealed in the worst cold. The work showed knowledge beyond the average settler's skill, hinting at prior experience in severe climates or guidance from experts before they arrived. Bridge and the girls prepared for that first Montana winter with methodical precision. They preserved meat with maximum efficiency, planted crops suited to short summers and poor soil, and rationed provisions with mathematical accuracy, an unusual skill for supposedly uneducated peasants. Still, those who met them on rare supply trips to Helena noticed strange things. The family members looked unnervingly alike: pale blue eyes, sharp features, unusually long fingers, creating an almost unnatural uniformity. The children were intelligent, disciplined, and eerily obedient, showing a caution around strangers and a submission to their parents that seemed born from fear rather than respect. Most unsettling were the odd conversations overheard by Jake Harrison, the territorial mail carrier who made his monthly route past their valley. Through the scattered mountain settlements, the Donnelly family stood apart. They often spoke in Irish Gaelic, but even in English, their conversations carried unusual themes. Talk of keeping their bloodline pure, the strength that came from proper breeding, and the sacrifices needed for the family's progress. These weren't the normal worries of frontier settlers just trying to survive. They hinted at deeper, more unsettling reasons for their isolation. The first real sign that something was very wrong with the Donnellys came in March 1875, when the spring thaw finally opened the mountain passes after 6 months of complete isolation. Jake Harrison, making his first mail delivery since the previous October, rode up to their cabin to bring government correspondence. The moment he arrived, he sensed that something grim had happened during the long winter. The cabin looked changed. New boards had been nailed over spots in the walls, as if covering holes. Fresh chinking filled gaps in a way that suggested damage from violence or some kind of struggle. Around the building, he saw signs of recent digging, even though the ground was still frozen. But the worst thing was the smell. A heavy, sickly, sweet odor clung to the place. One Harrison instantly recognized from years on the frontier as the scent of death and decay. Brig Donnelly met him at the door. Her appearance had altered so much that at first Harrison didn't even recognize her. The woman who had arrived in Montana just half a year earlier, nervous, but fairly healthy, now looked haggard and hollow-eyed. Her hands trembled as if from constant anxiety. Her dress hung loose on a much thinner frame, and streaks of premature gray ran through her hair. When she tried to speak, her voice cracked like it hadn't been used in weeks. The winter was hard, she whispered, glancing nervously toward the inside of the cabin. We had complications. Inside, Harrison found the family in the middle of a troubling scene. Brid was in labor, attended only by her teenage daughter Moira. What he saw during that afternoon would later become important evidence in understanding the family's dark history. The birth was carried out with an unsettling precision, like people who had done this many times before. The baby that came into the world was badly deformed. Its spine bent into an unnatural S shape. The left arm ended in a club, like hand with just 3 fingers, and its head was far too large, with a steeply sloped forehead suggesting severe developmental problems. The baby's breathing was shallow, and its weak cries had a muffled, mewing sound, as though more was wrong inside than could be seen. But the thing that disturbed Harrison the most was the family's reaction. There was no panic, no grief, no rush to help. Patrick and Bridge exchanged knowing looks, speaking quickly in Irish Gaelic. Harrison couldn't understand the words, but their tone wasn't that of parents shocked by tragedy. It was the tone of people calmly discussing what they already knew they would do. The child won't live the week, Patrick said flatly, though the baby's breathing, while labored, was steady, and its faint cries showed some will to live. The mountain air's too harsh for one so delicate. God's mercy, better to take them young than let them suffer. Harrison quickly offered to ride to Helena for a doctor, reminding Patrick that even severely deformed infants sometimes survived with proper care. But Patrick's pale blue eyes went cold, his voice carrying an authority that would not allow argument. "We handle our own," he said, laying a possessive hand on his wife's shoulder. "Some children aren't meant for this world. To meddle with God's will is to sin against nature itself." The words sounded rehearsed, as if Patrick had used them many times before, and beneath them was a warning. Anyone who interfered would face serious consequences. Seamus and young Declan, who had been working outside, came in during the birth. Neither boy looked surprised to see their mother in labor or the newborn so terribly deformed. This told Harrison it wasn't the first time they'd seen such a thing. When Harrison returned 2 weeks later with the regular mail, the baby was gone. Brig met him at the door with red-rimmed eyes, but they were dry, like someone long past the point of fresh grief. "Lost the baby 3 days after you left," she said in a flat voice. "Buried him behind the cabin with the others. The weak don't survive here, and that's for the best." The words, "with the others," sent a cold shiver down Harrison's spine. Behind the cabin, he now noticed for the first time, was a neat row of small wooden crosses over fresh earth. He counted 4 in all, far too small for adults. The crude dates carved into them showed they'd been made over the past 8 months. The graves bothered him. The earth looked disturbed in a way that suggested hurried work, not careful burial. The crosses were identical in size and style, like they'd been made ahead of time. Even the spacing between graves was exact, leaving room for more. That summer, Harrison kept a closer watch on the Donnellys during his monthly mail trips. Slowly, he built a picture of a household ruled by forces far darker than ordinary frontier hardship. The children moved with an exactness that hinted mistakes were punished harshly. They spoke to each other with a strange caution, like people sharing dangerous secrets. Moira and Colleen, though just 17 and 15, carried themselves like much older women, working with an efficiency that felt drilled into them. Their eyes, however, were haunted, as though they had seen things that destroyed their idea of what a family should be. When they addressed their parents, it was with a careful tone rooted in fear, not respect. Seamus, the eldest at 19, had developed a bad stutter that grew worse in his father's presence. He flinched at sudden movements and avoided meeting the eyes of anyone outside the family. When asked simple questions about home life, he would start to answer, then stop suddenly, falling silent as though he'd remembered a serious penalty for speaking too much. Declan, the youngest, seemed the most normal, but Harrison once caught him staring at the tiny cemetery behind the cabin with an expression not of sadness, but of pure fear. When Harrison gently asked about his dead siblings, Declan said, "Sometimes babies aren't right, and Father says God doesn't want them to suffer. But sometimes I think maybe God didn't decide." Then the boy clamped a hand over his mouth like he'd said something forbidden, and he didn't speak another word for the rest of the visit. On some approaches to the cabin, when Harrison came quietly through the woods, he overheard strange conversations. The family often spoke about keeping the blood pure, keeping the family strong, and honoring the sacrifices of their ancestors. Certain Irish phrases came up again and again. Ones Harrison couldn't translate, but the tone made them sound like part of some ritual or rule. They spoke of the others back home, of what's done with the weak, and most chillingly, of which children show the signs, and how to handle the imperfect ones. These moments painted a picture of a family bound by beliefs and practices older than their time in Montana, perhaps older than any of them. Their remote mountain cabin was not just a place to live. It was a place to carry out something far older, far darker, and far more deliberate. From civilization, it was a carefully selected place where the family could continue their customs that would have been impossible to keep under the watch of normal society. As 1875 moved into its bitter winter months, the Donnelly family's isolation became total once more. Snow blocked the mountain passes from November until March, cutting them off entirely from the outside world for the second time since they had arrived in Montana territory. Kuniaus ni mao tema komoma ordem. Freer, but it was during this second stretch of isolation that the true nature of their family's strange inheritance began to appear in ways that would soon draw the attention of territorial officials and shock even the toughest people on the frontier. Dr. Theodore Brennan, the territorial physician who would later examine the family, had arrived in Helena in October 1875, bringing with him medical books and knowledge that represented the latest thinking in hereditary science. A graduate of the University of Vienna, with extra training in Berlin and Edinburgh, Brennan had studied under doctors who were just beginning to explore the mechanisms of genetic inheritance. His collection included works by Francis Galton and other early pioneers of what would later be called genetics, giving him an understanding that most doctors would not have for decades. Brennan had come to Montana territory not for adventure or money, but to escape a professional scandal in Europe. His research into inherited traits had led him to conclusions about human breeding that his colleagues found disturbing, and his outspoken support for controlled reproduction to improve the human race had made him unwelcome in respectable medical circles. The frontier gave him anonymity and the freedom to continue his studies without interference from institutions. Ironically, it was the same freedom that had drawn the Donnelly family for their own unsettling purposes. In the winter of 1875-1876, Brennan received his first sign that something was seriously wrong in the mountain valleys when Jake Harrison came to his Helena office in February. Harrison had braved the dangerous winter trails to seek medical advice, and he described events that went beyond anything he had seen in his 8 years in the Montana wilderness. Strange lights were seen coming from the Donnelly cabin at odd hours of the night, smoke that rose in waves suggesting fires burned at unusual times and at strange heat levels, and worst of all, noises that carried across the frozen land on still winter nights. Dr. Harrison said, his weather-beaten face marked with worry and disbelief. "I've been carrying mail through these mountains for 8 years. I know the difference between normal frontier hardship and something truly wrong. What I'm hearing from that cabin in the dead of winter, it's not the sound of people handling ordinary troubles. There's crying that goes on for hours, then stops so suddenly it's like somebody flipped a switch. And there's singing. If that's even what you'd call it. That doesn't sound quite human. The tune is wrong, like it was made for voices that don't work the same way ours do. Harrison also spoke of things he had seen that troubled his steady frontier mind. The Donnelly cabin often had lights burning at times, when saving fuel should have been a matter of survival. The pattern of the light suggested tasks that needed steady brightness through the deepest hours of night, activities far from normal family routines. Most unsettling were the moments when Harrison spotted figures moving outside the cabin during raging snowstorms, times when being outdoors should have been impossible. These figures seemed unusually tall or moved with steps that didn't look entirely human in the swirling snow and shifting shadows. Brennan's medical instincts were immediately stirred by Harrison's accounts, but the winter weather made any trip to the Donnelly place impossible. The passes were buried under snow, so deep that travel would have been deadly, and even if he had somehow reached the cabin. Winter visits were usually only for emergencies where life hung in the balance. The Donnelly family had never asked for medical help, despite the troubling signs Harrison described. Instead of attempting such a perilous journey, Brennan began searching Irish immigration files and territorial records for any information about the family's past and their medical history. What he found only deepened the mystery and hinted at a pattern of deception that suggested their problems went far beyond the usual hardships of frontier life. The Donnellys had claimed they were from County Cork, Ireland, fleeing poverty and the crop failures that struck rural Irish areas in the 1860s and early 1870s. Their immigration papers told detailed stories of lost relatives, ruined farms, and economic hardship that forced them to seek a better life in America. But when Brennan carefully compared their claims to official Irish church records, troubling differences appeared. Relatives listed in their documents could not be confirmed in baptism or marriage records, which were normally trustworthy sources of family information. The farm locations they named did not match any existing property records from County Cork. Most troubling of all, the supposed poverty and crop failure did not match the large amount of gold they used to buy their Montana land, pay for transport across the continent, and set up their remote homestead. Even more disturbing were notes Brennan uncovered in New York immigration archives, files that officials had apparently ignored. A Donnelly family had indeed passed through Ellis Island in 1874, but immigration doctors had flagged them for strange physical features among the children that suggested possible inherited defects. The Medicom-OMA report mentioned signs of developmental irregularities matching certain genetic disorders, and noted how the parents became aggressive and secretive when questioned about their medical background. The examining doctor, Samuel Morrison, had recommended the family be kept for extended evaluation, but his advice was overruled by administrators, eager to process the endless line of new arrivals. Morrison's notes hinted that his concerns were not just medical. He believed the family was hiding information important to public safety. Brennan also found mention of other Donnelly families in different parts of America. One in Pennsylvania had been investigated in 1871 because of unusually high infant death rates. Another in Ohio had drawn attention in 1873 for suspected child neglect, though the case was dropped when they suddenly moved without leaving any forwarding details. The pattern suggested that the Montana Donnellys were not isolated troublemakers, but part of a wider web of related families who shared similar disturbing habits and moved often to avoid the law. The implications were shocking. If these were all branches of the same extended bloodline, their deliberate breeding practices and hidden acts of infanticide might have been taking place in several states for years, claiming dozens of young lives. As the spring thaw of 1876 began to open the trails, Brennan grew increasingly obsessed with the mystery. His training told him that isolated communities often developed inherited problems because of limited genetic variety, a well-known fact in history. But this family seemed to be something else entirely, showing a pattern more intentional and controlled than mere isolation could explain. Harrison's unsettling accounts the suspicious immigration history, and the evidence of connections to other strange Donnelly families convinced Brennan that this was unlike anything he had ever seen, a family that had purposely experimented on their own bloodline, no matter the cost to their children or anyone else. When the snow finally melted enough for travel, Dr. Brennan resolved to go to the Donnelly homestead himself. Under the cover of offering ordinary medical care to a far-off frontier family, what he discovered there would forever change how he understood human nature and the dangerous possibilities hidden in its inheritance, science, and the lengths to which people would go to protect family secrets passed down through multiple generations. The journey to the Donnelly cabin took an entire day of grueling travel through terrain that seemed almost purposely chosen for its remoteness. The path wound through thick forests, across unstable creek beds, and up steep mountain slopes that would have challenged even the most seasoned riders. The isolation was so complete that Brennan met no other travelers, saw no trace of neighboring homesteads, and found no sign that anyone had used the trail in months. The cabin itself looked deceptively ordinary from the outside, solidly built, well cared for, with the signs of productive farming and healthy livestock that hinted at a family thriving in frontier life. The land around it showed the marks of hard work and clever use. Neatly tended vegetable gardens, sturdy animal shelters, and water channels that revealed advanced farming skills. But Brennan's trained medical eye immediately caught troubling details that most visitors would have missed. The family graveyard behind the cabin held far too many burial sites for a household that claimed to have lost only the occasional infant to the brutal frontier conditions. Brennan counted 11 wooden crosses, each over a plot clearly too small for an adult, all bearing dates that revealed deaths occurring with suspicious regularity, instead of the irregular clusters typical of disease outbreaks or severe storms. The graves were set in orderly rows, suggesting deliberate planning rather than hasty burials during unexpected tragedies. More unsettling still was the evidence of recent expansion. Fresh axe marks on nearby trees and newly turned soil hinted that additional burial sites were being prepared in advance. Preparations that suggested the family anticipated more deaths rather than prayed to avoid them. The crosses already standing all showed similar workmanship and aging, as if made in groups instead of one at a time for each lost child. Patrick Tomoyumo Ordumfria Patrick Donnelly met Brennan at the door with a mix of rural hospitality and faintly concealed wariness that immediately stirred the doctor's professional instincts. The patriarch had aged strikingly since Harrison's description of him a year earlier. His hair was now entirely white despite looking no older than 45, and deep furrows lined his face in patterns that pointed to constant strain rather than the slow marks of time. His hands quivered slightly when he thought no one was watching, and there was a haunted look in his eyes, one Brennan had seen in patients carrying deep psychological scars. "We don't need a doctor here," Patrick said with forced steadiness, but his voice lacked the strength to match his words. "We've always handled our own troubles the same way our people did back in the old country. Bringing strangers into family matters only stirs up problems best solved the traditional way." The brig appeared behind her husband, and Brennan was taken aback by how much she had withered since Harrison's earlier account. The woman who had given birth barely a year ago now appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, her thin frame causing her clothes to hang loosely, almost like fabric draped over a skeleton. Her hands trembled in a constant, faint shake that could signal nerve disorders, prolonged malnutrition, or psychological strain so severe it manifested physically. When she tried to speak, Patrick silenced her with a sharp glance, an exchange that hinted at long-standing dominance and punishments for disobedience that went beyond ordinary marital authority. It was the children, however, who gave the clearest signs of the family's grim secrets and distorted way of life. Moira, now 18, was visibly pregnant once more, her condition far enough along to suggest conception, during the snowbound winter months when no outsiders could have reached the cabin. The timing, combined with the family's isolation and unusual genetic traits, raised questions that disturbed Brennan both as a doctor and as a man. Colleen, now 16, showed signs of early and accelerated physical maturity well beyond her years. Her adult-like features hinted at hormonal irregularities, possibly stemming from genetic issues or environmental factors. Even more troubling was her manner with her parents, a blend of adult composure and unnatural submission that suggested life experiences inappropriate for someone so young. The most alarming change was in Declan, now 13, who had developed striking physical deformities since Harrison's last visit. His face was noticeably uneven, one side appearing normal, while the other showed signs of halted development or malformation. He walked with a deep limp that hinted at a curved spine, and his hands displayed elongated fingers with joints unusually flexible, symptoms Brennan recognized as potential markers of inherited connective tissue disorders. During his short initial visit, Brennan witnessed family interactions that broke from normal social patterns and pointed toward intense psychological pressures far beyond standard frontier hardships. The older children obeyed their parents with a mix of fear and resignation, suggesting punishments for disobedience far harsher than ordinary discipline. Their movements were measured and cautious, as though they had learned that acting freely could provoke sudden and dangerous reactions. Seamus, the eldest at 20, avoided looking at either parent or the visiting doctor. His stutter had worsened to where speaking was a struggle, and he seemed locked in an inner conflict that left him restless and unsettled. Whenever Brennan asked him directly about home life or his health, Seamus would start to answer, then abruptly stop mid-sentence, as if reminded of severe consequences for revealing too much to outsiders. The cabin's interior arrangements also struck Brennan as unusual for a frontier household. It was divided into more separate rooms than privacy alone would require, with thick curtains and locked doors that felt intended to hide activities rather than simply organize living space. From behind these barriers, sounds suggesting ongoing work the family did not want seen, along with odors, medicinal, organic, and faintly unsettling, that hinted at practices outside normal herbal remedies or food storage. As Brennan prepared to leave after his initial look, Patrick drew him aside with an urgency that bordered on desperation. His tone was that of a man torn between guarding family secrets and seeking help for a crisis beyond his control. "Doctor," Patrick whispered, glancing toward the cabin to make sure no one overheard, "if I told you that sometimes God tests families in ways that demand terrible choices, would you understand? Could you help without asking questions that would bring trouble to people already carrying heavy burdens?" Before Brennan could answer, Patrick pressed on, his voice tightening. "Our bloodline is strong, but it carries complications. We've learned to live with them through methods handed down by our fathers and their fathers before them. Those methods worked in the old country. But here in Montana people expect different things. More, they ask questions we can't answer without exposing practices that outsiders wouldn't understand and wouldn't forgive." Patrick's carefully chosen words sent a chill through Brennan's professional composure. He began to grasp that the Donnellys' seclusion wasn't simply about hiding odd behavior. It was about concealing deliberate, organized customs that would horrify even the rough-edged society of the frontier. Traditions honed and perfected over generations, now transplanted to the wilderness of America. 2 months later, Brennan received an urgent note from J. Harrison that forced him to face the full terror of the Donnelly family's inherited curse. A local trapper, braving the perilous mountain path, brought the message, just a few hurried, unevenly written words: "Donnelly woman in hard labor. Family calling for doctor. Something wrong beyond normal birth pains. Come fast if possible." For the first time since they had arrived in the Montana Territory, the Donnelly family was seeking medical help from outsiders, a sharp break from their long-standing habit of keeping all matters within the family. The fact that they had pushed past their intense secrecy to request assistance suggested that even their considerable experience with difficult births couldn't offer a solution. Brennan reached the mountain cabin on a sweltering July afternoon, only to face a sight that would haunt his dreams for decades. The scorching heat had turned the isolated valley into an oven, and the air hung thick and heavy, making every breath an effort even for those in perfect health. Inside the cabin, the air was even more suffocating, thick with the smells of sweat, blood, and something else, a faintly sweet, rotting odor that Brennan couldn't name right away, but which set off a deep, instinctive alarm. Moira Donnelly lay in the back room of the cabin, her labor complicated by conditions Brennan recognized immediately. She was giving birth to twins, but these were not ordinary twins. The babies were joined at the torso and appeared to share critical internal organs, a condition that Brennan knew almost always ended in death in an era before advanced surgery. What shocked him most wasn't the medical difficulty, but the family's unsettling response. Rather than showing fear, grief, or desperate prayers for a miracle, as most parents would, they acted with an eerie calm, moving with the efficiency of people following a practiced routine. Patrick and Brig worked together like a team, executing well rehearsed steps. Shemos and Colleen prepared tools and supplies that clearly weren't meant for celebrating a birth, but for handling a crisis that demanded quick, decisive action. The twins presented a medical challenge that would have overwhelmed even the best hospitals of the time. They were not only physically connected, but seemed to share a joint cardiovascular and nervous system, making separation impossible with the crude tools of 1876. One baby was visibly stronger, but both showed enough life that they could have survived for days, or even weeks with proper care. "Doctor," Patrick said with a chilling calm, "we need you to tell us truthfully. Can they be separated? Is there any chance one might survive as a healthy child?" As Brennan examined the twins, his eyes caught something that froze his blood. Hidden under the birthing bed were several leather-bound journals, their pages filled with precise drawings and notes describing similar births over what looked like many decades. Page after page contained detailed anatomical sketches, infants with deformities, missing limbs, cleft palates, twisted spines, extra fingers, and other conditions Brennan had never before seen recorded with such exactness. The drawings were labeled in both Irish Gaelic and English, with dated entries spanning decades and tracking births across different parts of Ireland and America. Some entries described in detail the remedial measures taken to handle these conditions, using terms that suggested medical knowledge far beyond that of typical frontier families. The dates and places formed a map of the family's movements over more than 50 years. Most disturbing were the cold, clinical quality of life notes that accompanied each sketch. It was clear these records documented the family's systematic judging of newborns, deciding which traits were acceptable and which would not be allowed to continue in the bloodline. Bridge noticed Brennan's discovery and spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady, carrying the weight of old, grim certainty. "The bloodline must stay pure, Doctor. Weakness cannot be allowed to spread to the next generations. Our people learned this the hard way over many years back in the old country. What looks cruel to outsiders is in truth a mercy for the children who would suffer and for the family line that must be protected." Her words had the conviction of religious teaching. But the belief she described was not about faith in God. It was about controlling human breeding. It broke every rule of medical ethics Brennan had ever learned. The Donnellys weren't simply killing infants. They were carrying out a cold, methodical breeding program, treating humans like livestock, removing what they considered undesirable traits. The journals contained even more proof, family charts showing generations of deliberate inbreeding, explaining the high number of birth defects. Patrick and Brig weren't just husband and wife, they were first cousins. This practice went back at least 5 generations, all carefully planned to preserve what they believed were the best traits. The earliest records showed it began in Ireland in the early 1800s, when Patrick's great-grandfather became convinced that the Irish could be improved through selective breeding, much like cattle or horses. He had twisted both biblical genealogy and false racial theories that were fashionable among certain intellectual circles in Europe at the time to justify his plan. As Brennan examined the twins and studied the notes, he understood that he was looking at the final product of a long, inhuman experiment, one that ignored the suffering it caused. These babies weren't an accident, they were the inevitable outcome of decades of manipulation. The conjoined twins gasped and struggled for air in their rough cradle, their tiny bodies working against a shared, failing heart. It was no random tragedy. It was the dark harvest of generations. Just when we thought we'd seen everything, the horror in the Montana mountains deepened. If this story makes your skin crawl, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support more stories like this, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. The urgent situation with the twins forced Brennan into choices that would haunt him forever. The babies were clearly in pain, their breathing ragged, their shared heart unable to keep up. No surgery could save them with the primitive tools in that cabin. But letting them linger without any attempt to ease their suffering clashed with every oath Brennan had taken. Through the night, Brennan read the hidden journals as the twins fought for life. The scope of what the family had been doing became horrifyingly clear. These were not just records of births, but evidence of a century-long program of human breeding and culling, recorded with scientific discipline. The oldest entries, in faded brown ink and old Irish script, told how the Donnelly patriarch Fergus Donnelly began the practice in County Cork in the 1790s after speaking with learned men who claimed to understand the science of bloodlines. They believed, as the journals put it, in the improvement of human stock.